Good morning, everybody. It's July 19th, 2026, and this is one of those stories where the headline actually undersells what's happening, because what we're watching right now is Iran drawing its single hardest red line of the entire war, refusing to give up its enriched uranium stockpile, and the United States responding not with a statement, but by putting a specific mountain on the target list. So welcome back to the channel. Same as every day, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Iran said, exactly what the US response has actually been, what this mountain is, and why it's such a difficult target, even for American bunker busters. And then I'll give you my honest read on whether this is posturing or whether we're looking at the next major strike of this war. Let's get into it. Let's start with what Iran actually said, because the phrase red line has been used loosely throughout this entire conflict by both governments and by nearly every commentator covering it. But this time, it's coming from multiple directions at once, and it's specifically about the uranium rather than territory or sanctions. Iran's foreign ministry has directly rejected U.S. demands to hand over its enriched uranium stockpile, reaffirming that the issue was never actually part of the current ceasefire framework in the first place, no matter how Washington has tried to characterize it. Ebrahim Azizi, who heads Iran's Parliamentary Security Committee, has publicly listed uranium enrichment alongside sanctions relief and control of the Strait of Hormuz as non-negotiable red lines as peace talks have stalled. And just 2 days ago, CNN's live coverage carried the headline that Iran is now calling the Strait of Hormuz an unbreakable red line as the U.S. expands strikes, which tells you the rhetoric on the Iranian side has only hardened as the pressure has increased rather than softened. This is coming from a leadership structure that, as I've covered on this channel before, has already been gutted twice over since February. And yet, on this one specific issue, the uranium, they are holding the line with more consistency than almost anything else they've said throughout this entire war. Here's why this particular red line matters so much more than the others. And it's worth taking the time to actually walk through the numbers rather than just repeating the phrase red line without context. We're talking about roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, which is a stockpile large enough, according to non-proliferation experts, to be converted into weapons-grade material for multiple nuclear devices if it were further refined. Iran is the only country in the world without a declared nuclear weapons program that has ever accumulated uranium enriched to that level, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been trying and failing to get verified access to confirm exactly where that material actually is for the better part of a year now. Iran's foreign minister said back in March that the enriched uranium is, in his words, buried under the rubble created by the strikes on Iran's enrichment facilities back in June of last year, and that Iran has no plan to recover it. But here's the problem with taking that at face value. The International Atomic Energy Agency has explicitly stated that Iran's continued refusal to engage constructively with inspectors on this exact question is a matter of proliferation concern, meaning the international nuclear watchdog itself is not convinced that story is the full picture. So now let's get to the actual response, because this is where the video title comes in, and it's worth walking through the sequence of events carefully rather than jumping straight to the headline. Earlier this week, during an interview with radio host Hugh Hewitt, President Trump was asked directly whether Iran has a fourth nuclear site beyond the three that were already struck last year: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. His answer was to name a specific location, a facility that American military and intelligence circles have nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain, and to describe it as a target for what he called a big, beautiful strike right through the front door, adding that Americans might see that very soon. That's not vague saber rattling about the war in general. That's the President of the United States naming a specific, previously classified nuclear-adjacent facility on live radio and describing an active plan to hit it. And this didn't come out of nowhere. It came in the same week that American forces reinstated the naval blockade on Iranian ports, launched a seventh consecutive night of strikes, and started systematically dismantling bridges and infrastructure across southern Iran, which I covered in detail in the last video on this channel. So when Iran said the uranium is off the table entirely, the American response wasn't a diplomatic statement. It was Trump publicly naming the next likely target on the list. Let's talk about what Pickaxe Mountain actually is, because I think once you understand this facility in real detail, not just as a nickname in a headline, you'll understand exactly why it's become the center of so much attention right now. Known in Persian as Ku-e-Kolangazla, which translates roughly to Pickaxe Mountain, the site sits in the Zagros mountain range in Isfahan province, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 kilometers south of the main Natanz enrichment complex. It's not a small facility either. The secured compound covers roughly 1 square kilometer of mountainside, with a security fence running for kilometers that connects directly into the perimeter around Natanz itself. There are 2 paved access roads climbing up toward the site, leading to at least 2, and by some assessments, 4, separate tunnel entrances carved directly into rock. The mountain itself rises over 1,600 meters above sea level and is considerably taller than the mountain that houses the Fordo facility, which was already one of the hardest targets American forces had ever gone after when it was struck with bunker busters back in June of last year. Analysts studying commercial satellite imagery believe the underground complex at Pickaxe Mountain may be buried as deep as 600 meters beneath solid granite, which, if accurate, would make it significantly harder to destroy than Fordo ever was, and Fordo itself required 2 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, the largest conventional bunker buster in the American arsenal, dropped by B-2 stealth bombers, just to inflict what officials described as major damage rather than complete destruction. Iran's official position is that the underground complex is meant to replace a centrifuge assembly plant that was destroyed in the earlier strikes, essentially a manufacturing and assembly facility rather than an active enrichment site. And Iranian officials have repeated that explanation consistently whenever the site has come up publicly. But independent nuclear analysts studying the satellite imagery have pushed back hard on that explanation. One assessment from the Open Nuclear Network described the site as a deeply buried, nuclear-related facility being actively hardened and prepared for large-scale industrial use, which is a much more serious characterization than a simple assembly plant. The Institute for Science and International Security, a non-proliferation think tank that's been tracking this site closely through satellite imagery for a long stretch of this war, has documented Iran reinforcing tunnel entrances with concrete headwork specifically designed to add additional overburden of rock, soil, or concrete on top of the portals. A defensive measure clearly intended to blunt the effectiveness of exactly the kind of penetrator bombs that were used against Fordo. According to that same institute's most recent public reporting, Iran has also partially filled some of the tunnel portals to block vehicle access entirely and has sealed off a smaller, older tunnel complex within the same perimeter that was originally built back in 2007 and expanded more recently, and nobody outside of Iran actually knows what's inside those sealed tunnels, though the obvious concern is that it could be part of the enriched uranium stockpile itself. I want to pause here and separate rumor from confirmed fact, because there's a lot of speculation swirling around this story right now, and I'd rather be straight with you about what's actually verified than let you walk away from this video with a false sense of certainty either way. It is confirmed that construction and reinforcement activity has been ongoing at Pickaxe Mountain for months now. That's based on multiple rounds of independent satellite imagery analysis from a credible non-proliferation institute, not just an anonymous claim floating around online. It is confirmed that Trump named the site publicly and described it as a target. What is not confirmed is whether any part of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is actually stored inside that mountain right now, whether the facility has any operational enrichment capability as opposed to just assembly or storage functions, and whether the strike Trump described is imminent or just another round of the same rhetorical pressure campaign we've heard from him throughout this war since it began back in February. Non-proliferation researchers studying this facility have generally assessed that most of the complex does not yet appear to be operational. Construction is still ongoing according to the most recent imagery reviewed, which actually complicates the calculus around striking it right now, because you could argue there's more strategic value in continuing to monitor it and gather intelligence on what Iran intends to use it for than in striking a facility that isn't yet functional. Let's talk about the military side of this for a minute, because I think it's important to understand just how difficult a target this actually is, even for the most advanced conventional weapons in the American arsenal. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator that was used against Fordo weighs around 30,000 pounds and is specifically designed to punch through layers of reinforced concrete and rock before detonating. But even that weapon has real limits, and the fact that it took 2 of them dropped by B-2 stealth bombers just to achieve what officials described as major damage, rather than total destruction. At Fordo tells you something about how difficult deeply buried, hardened targets actually are to eliminate with conventional air power. Analysts studying Pickaxe Mountain have pointed out there's a real tension between the kind of maximalist promises you hear in a radio interview, a big, beautiful strike right through the front door, and what conventional weapons can actually achieve against a target that may be buried, significantly deeper than Fordo ever was. That doesn't mean a strike wouldn't happen or that it wouldn't do real damage, but it does mean you should be skeptical of any claim from either side that a single strike package could definitively eliminate everything inside that mountain in one clean operation the way Trump's rhetoric sometimes implies. I want to walk through the actual physics of why depth matters so much here, because I think it helps explain the skepticism coming from independent analysts. A penetrator weapon, like the GBU-57, works by using kinetic energy and a hardened casing to physically punch through layer after layer of rock and concrete before its fuse triggers detonation at, or ideally past, the target depth. Every additional meter of solid granite a weapon has to punch through before reaching its target reduces the remaining energy available to actually destroy whatever's on the other side. And unlike a surface target where a near miss can still cause significant blast damage, a deeply buried tunnel complex is largely immune to anything that doesn't achieve a fairly precise penetration depth. If Pickaxe Mountain really is buried as deep as 600 meters beneath solid granite, as some assessments suggest, that would put it meaningfully beyond what most public estimates consider the maximum effective penetration depth of even the largest weapons currently in the American inventory, which is exactly why you've seen some non-proliferation analysts openly question whether conventional air power alone, no matter how many sorties are flown, can actually achieve a decisive result against this specific facility without some combination of repeated strikes, specialized penetrator designs, or entirely different approaches like direct ground action to physically seal or destroy tunnel entrances and ventilation shafts. That last detail matters more than people realize, because both of the previously struck Iranian tunnel facilities, built under Iran's original Ahmad weapons program, had their ventilation shafts specifically targeted during earlier strikes rather than the main tunnel body itself, since cutting off airflow and cooling to a deeply buried facility can sometimes achieve as much practical damage as trying to punch straight through hundreds of meters of solid rock. I also want to bring in what non-proliferation experts outside the government are saying, because I think it adds useful context beyond just the political back and forth between Washington and Tehran. Andrea Stricker, who studies non-proliferation policy, laid out what she sees as two urgent, unfinished tasks before any real end to major combat operations against Iran could happen. And I'll paraphrase her because I think it's a genuinely useful framework. First, neutralizing Pickaxe Mountain specifically, and second, recovering or eliminating the highly enriched uranium stockpile entirely, so that it can't fall into the hands of whatever's left of the regime, other adversarial states, or non-state actors down the line. That second point is honestly the part I think doesn't get enough attention in the day-to-day headlines about strikes and counterstrikes. Because even if this war eventually ends in some kind of negotiated settlement, 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium sitting somewhere in Iran, whereabouts unconfirmed, verification access denied, is the kind of loose end that could shape nuclear proliferation risk in that region for years after the shooting actually stops. I want to spend some time on the IAEA's role in all of this too, because I think it's the part of the story that gets the least attention despite being arguably the most important piece for understanding how this actually gets resolved, if it gets resolved at all. The International Atomic Energy Agency is the body responsible for verifying that a country's declared nuclear material stays where it's supposed to stay and isn't diverted toward weapons production, and its entire verification system depends on physical access, inspectors on the ground, cameras installed at declared facilities, and regular reporting from the country being monitored. Iran has not provided that access at the affected facilities for close to a year now, which the agency itself has explicitly flagged as long overdue by standard safeguards practice. That's not a minor bureaucratic complaint. Verification timeliness matters enormously in nuclear safeguards because the entire system is built around detecting diversion of material within a specific window, and once that window closes without access, the agency effectively loses its ability to provide any real assurance about where that material actually is or what's been done with it. So when Iran's foreign minister says the uranium is buried under rubble and there's no plan to recover it, that's not something the IAEA can verify independently. It's simply Iran's own claim. And the agency has made clear in its reporting that it considers the lack of access itself to be a proliferation concern, regardless of whether Iran's explanation turns out to be true. That's the structural reason this dispute is so hard to resolve through normal diplomatic channels, because unlike a territorial dispute or a sanctions negotiation, where both sides can eventually agree to terms they both trust, a nuclear verification dispute requires actual physical access to resolve, and Iran granting that access is precisely the thing it has refused to do throughout this entire standoff. This connects to something worth remembering about how nuclear proliferation risks actually play out over time, which is that they rarely resolve cleanly through a single dramatic event, whether that's a strike or a diplomatic breakthrough. Even in cases where facilities get physically destroyed, the underlying knowledge, the trained personnel, and in this case, potentially the physical material itself, doesn't simply disappear along with the buildings. That's part of why non-proliferation experts tend to talk about degrading or setting back a program rather than eliminating it outright, because the honest technical reality is that a sufficiently motivated state with the resources Iran still has access to, even under blockade and sanctions, retains meaningful capability to eventually reconstitute some version of an enrichment program, unless the underlying material itself is verifiably accounted for and removed. That's the entire reason Pickaxe Mountain matters as much as it does right now, not because of what the facility can do today, since most assessments suggest it isn't yet fully operational, but because of what it could become years down the road if this war ends without ever resolving where Iran's existing enriched material actually is. Let's connect this back to the broader pattern we've been tracking on this channel, because I don't think this story exists in isolation from everything else that's happened this week. If you watched the last video, you know the US has been running a systematic campaign against bridges, railway junctions, and power infrastructure in southern Iran, methodically cutting the physical connections that would let Iran's fragmented leadership coordinate anything across that coastal region. And if you go back further, you know that campaign itself followed a leadership decapitation strategy going back to February that took out Iran's supreme leader, and weeks later, the man who stepped up to actually run the war in his place. What we're watching now with the Uranium and Pickaxe Mountain fits into that exact same pattern, just applied to the nuclear dimension of this conflict instead of the command structure or the logistics network. First, you remove the people making decisions, then you remove their ability to coordinate and move resources, and now it looks like the next phase may be removing whatever physical capability remains for Iran to ever reconstitute a nuclear weapons program, buried mountain and all. Every single piece of this war, when you actually connect the dots across weeks and months instead of watching it as isolated headlines, points toward the same underlying objective: permanently eliminating Iran's capacity to threaten the region in any form, whether that's missiles, naval power, command structure, or nuclear capability. Let's talk rhetoric for a second, because both sides have been extremely loud this week, and I think it's worth breaking down what's actually being said versus what's just noise, since rhetoric in this war has repeatedly turned out to be a leading indicator of what actually happens next. On the Iranian side, you've had the Foreign Ministry's direct rejection of the uranium handover demand, Azizi's public declaration of the 3 red lines, and separately, IRGC official Mohsen Rezaiei warning that no political border would be secure against what he described as Iran's offensive forces, along with demands that the United States pay financial reparations for strikes on what Iran characterizes as civilian infrastructure, a characterization the U.S. has flatly denied. On the American side, you've had Trump declaring the ceasefire and memorandum of understanding over, naming Pickaxe Mountain specifically as a target, and separately telling radio audiences that strikes would continue hitting Iran hard, night after night, with, in his words, not a damn thing they can do about it. Both governments are talking in absolutes right now. Unbreakable red lines on one side, a big, beautiful strike right through the front door on the other, and when you have 2 governments both speaking in that kind of maximalist language simultaneously, that's usually a sign that we're closer to some kind of significant escalation than we are to a negotiated settlement, at least in the near term. I want to spend some time on the history here too, because this isn't actually the first time American bunker busters have gone after Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and understanding what happened last time tells you a lot about how uncertain the outcome of a strike like this really is. Back in June of last year, during what's now referred to as the 12-Day War, American B-2 stealth bombers struck all 3 of Iran's primary nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, in a single coordinated operation, dropping a full payload of the bunker buster bombs on Fordo specifically. Trump described it at the time as a spectacular success, and U.S. officials initially said all 3 sites sustained what they called extremely severe damage and destruction, with Natanz effectively destroyed and Fordo and Isfahan suffering major damage. But here's the part that matters for understanding what might happen at Pickaxe Mountain. The actual damage assessment afterward was nowhere near as unanimous as that initial announcement suggested. A leaked Defense Intelligence Agency report reportedly concluded the sites were damaged but not destroyed, and that Iran's nuclear program had only been delayed by a matter of months rather than the years the administration initially claimed. Israeli intelligence reportedly reached a similar conclusion, that the sites were damaged, but Iran's underlying nuclear program had not actually been eliminated. Iran itself gave conflicting public statements, initially calling the damage quite superficial with no irreversible harm, before later acknowledging what officials called significant and serious damages. The IAEA, for its part, said the sites suffered enormous damage without giving a definitive verdict on whether the program itself had been set back permanently or just temporarily. I bring all of this up because it's a pattern worth remembering. Every time a strike like this happens, you get an initial triumphant announcement, followed weeks later by a much messier, much more contested picture once independent assessments start coming in, and I'd expect the exact same pattern to play out if and when Pickaxe Mountain actually gets hit. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of strikes against hardened targets generally. The immediate battle damage assessment made from satellite imagery and pilot reports right after a strike is almost always more optimistic than what later, more thorough analysis eventually reveals, simply because you can't always tell from an aerial photograph of a collapsed tunnel entrance whether the facility behind it has been rendered permanently unusable or whether workers with enough time and enough equipment could eventually dig it back out and resume operations. Let me walk through a few of the theories floating around right now about what actually happens next, because as always I want to separate speculation from what's confirmed before giving you my own take. One theory circulating among defense commentators is that naming Pickaxe Mountain publicly on a radio interview was itself a form of psychological pressure rather than a genuine operational announcement. The idea being that by putting the facility in the news cycle and forcing international attention onto it, the administration increases pressure on Iran to allow IAEA access voluntarily rather than risk an actual strike, without the U.S. having to commit to the enormous cost and uncertainty of an actual bombing run against a target that deep. That theory has some real logic behind it, because Trump himself said in the same interview that he wanted the IAEA to inspect the site, which is a strange thing to say in the same breath as threatening to bomb it unless the underlying goal is really about forcing transparency rather than destruction. The second theory, favored by some of the more hawkish commentators covering this war, is that the administration has already made the decision to strike, and the public comments are simply the standard pattern of signaling before action that we've seen throughout this entire conflict. Remember, Trump gave a similar public warning before the bridge and infrastructure campaign intensified, and before the original June strikes on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan last year. A third theory, and this one gets less attention but I think deserves more, is that the delay in actually striking Pickaxe Mountain reflects genuine internal disagreement within the administration about whether it's even possible to achieve a decisive result against a facility buried that deep, meaning some faction may be pushing for the strike publicly while military planners privately push back on the feasibility, which would explain why we've seen strong rhetoric without an actual strike materializing in the days since that interview aired. I want to spend a little more time on the diplomatic backdrop here too, because I think it explains why this uranium dispute has become such a flashpoint specifically right now rather than earlier in the war. Going back to the ceasefire and memorandum of understanding reached in June, the core bargain on the table was always understood to involve Iran downblending or otherwise disposing of its enriched uranium stockpile under IAEA verification in exchange for meaningful sanctions, relief, and access to a reconstruction fund that's been reported at somewhere around $300 billion. Iranian officials have consistently pushed back on that framing, describing the uranium question as postponed rather than agreed to, and citing what they say is a direct supreme leader directive against ever exporting or surrendering the material. That gap between how Washington describes the agreement and how Tehran describes it has been one of the most persistent sources of friction throughout the entire ceasefire period, with both sides essentially operating off different understandings of what was actually promised. And every time that gap becomes public again, whether through a foreign ministry statement or a parliamentary red line declaration, it resets the diplomatic clock and makes the underlying dispute harder to resolve through normal negotiation channels. I think that's ultimately why we're seeing such a sharp response from Washington this week, not because anything fundamentally new happened with the uranium itself, but because Iran's public rejection of the handover framework this week was blunt enough and clear enough that it closed off the diplomatic ambiguity that had let both sides avoid directly confronting this issue for the past several weeks. Let's get into the global roundup section, because there's context around this that ties directly back to the broader war and shouldn't get lost in the noise of a single headline about one mountain. This uranium standoff is happening at the same time the U.S. has reinstated the full naval blockade on Iranian ports. At the same time, Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit have been conducting verification boardings of tankers, trying to slip past that blockade. And at the same time, the infrastructure campaign against bridges and power lines in southern Iran has entered its second consecutive week. Several Arab nations in the region have been vocal in criticizing Iran's pattern of striking at American allies like Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain in retaliation for these strikes, even as some of those same nations privately express concern about the pace and intensity of the broader campaign. And there's a diplomatic subplot running underneath all of this too, because Vice President Vance recently gave an interview suggesting that Israel had been actively working to sway American public opinion against continued diplomacy with Iran, which, if accurate, would suggest there's real disagreement within the American foreign policy apparatus itself about whether the current maximalist strategy, uranium recovery, Pickaxe Mountain, continued blockade enforcement, is actually the right path forward, or whether there's a faction within the administration that would prefer to find some kind of negotiated resolution sooner rather than later. Let me give you my actual read on where this goes from here, drawing together everything I've laid out above about the stockpile, the mountain, and the verification standoff. I think the uranium stockpile and Pickaxe Mountain represent the single hardest, most consequential unresolved issue of this entire war, harder in some ways than the Strait of Hormuz dispute, because oil shipping lanes can eventually be reopened through negotiation or through simple exhaustion on Iran's side. But 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium sitting somewhere inside Iranian territory, unverified and unaccounted for, is not the kind of problem that resolves itself just because both sides get tired of fighting. I think there's a real chance we see some kind of strike on Pickaxe Mountain in the coming weeks, especially given how directly and specifically Trump named it, but I'd caution you against assuming that strike, if it happens, resolves the underlying problem the way the June strikes were initially claimed to. Based on everything we know about how deeply buried and how heavily reinforced this facility appears to be, and based on the messy, contested aftermath of the strikes on Fordo last year, I think the far more likely outcome is another round of the same pattern, a confident announcement followed by weeks of contested damage assessments, followed by continued uncertainty about whether Iran's underlying capability has actually been eliminated or just temporarily set back again. I also think the uranium stockpile question specifically may end up being the issue that determines whether this war has any realistic diplomatic off-ramp at all in the near term, more so than any of the other flashpoints we've discussed on this channel. Every other major point of friction in this conflict, the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions relief, even the leadership vacuum in Tehran, has some plausible negotiated pathway forward, if both sides eventually decide the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of compromise. The uranium is different because it's not really a negotiating chip in the traditional sense. It's a proliferation risk that the United States and the broader international community have strong reasons not to simply accept as unresolved, regardless of how exhausted either side becomes with the broader war. That's part of why I think this specific story, more than almost anything else happening in this conflict right now, deserves your attention, because it's less about who wins the argument over Hormuz and more about whether this war ends with a clear, verified resolution to Iran's nuclear material, or whether it ends with that question still hanging over the region indefinitely, waiting to resurface as a crisis all over again years down the road. One more thing before I wrap up, because I think it's worth being honest about the uncertainty here, rather than pretending anyone, including me, has perfect visibility into what happens next. Nuclear facility strikes are genuinely different from the infrastructure and leadership strikes we've talked about on this channel in previous videos, because the stakes of getting the intelligence wrong are so much higher. If American planners strike Pickaxe Mountain based on the assumption that enriched material is stored there and it turns out the sealed tunnels contain something else entirely, that's a wasted strike against a target that may not have had the strategic value assumed. But if they hold off, and that assumption turns out to be correct, and Iran does eventually use that facility to reconstitute some version of an enrichment or weapons program once international attention moves elsewhere, that's a very different kind of failure, one with consequences that could last for decades. I don't think there's an obviously correct answer here, and I think that tension, more than any of the rhetoric coming out of either government this week, is the real story behind this headline. It's also worth remembering that this same tension has played out before in nuclear non-proliferation history, going back decades, where strikes on suspected weapons infrastructure in other countries have sometimes set programs back by years, and other times simply pushed them further underground. Literally in this case, making them harder to monitor rather than eliminating the underlying capability entirely. That historical pattern is exactly why so many non-proliferation analysts keep circling back to verification and access as the real solution here, rather than betting everything on a single dramatic strike, solving a problem that's fundamentally about accountability and transparency, as much as it is about physical destruction. So here's what I want to know from you guys. Drop it in the comments and give me your honest read, not just a guess. Do you think the United States actually strikes Pickaxe Mountain in the near term, the way Trump's comments suggested? Or do you think this ends up being another round of pressure rhetoric that doesn't translate into an actual strike anytime soon? The way we've seen happen before in this war, when tough talk didn't immediately match the timeline that followed. I read every comment, so let me know where you land. And if you want to keep following this story as it develops, along with everything else happening across this war, the bridges, the blockade, the leadership vacuum in Tehran, and now this nuclear standoff, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm going to keep tracking every piece of it exactly the way I have been every single day. Footage and confirmed facts first, my honest read second. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate every one of you, and I'll see you in the next one.